Lyndhurst's older references, a north wing and a record room, are mentioned as if they were standard parts of the house. In today's simplified plans, that line is gone, and that kind of omission doesn't happen by accident. This video examines Lyndhurst Mansion, originally spelled Lindenhurst, in Tarrytown, New York, and the quiet way a historic estate can be altered without ever looking changed. The title is not a metaphor. Lyndhurst's public story presents preservation, continuity, and curated access. But one specific inconsistency suggests something more deliberate. My verdict is simple. The house was not only maintained over time, it was edited in a way that protects a version of its legacy. We can anchor this in a concrete point: 1865, a decisive phase of expansion for the property in the period just after the American Civil War. That date matters because it sits inside a real historical moment when fortunes, reputations, and institutions were being reorganized at speed. The war had ended that same year, and the country's economic and social order was shifting into what would soon become the Gilded Age, an era when public respectability could be manufactured as carefully as capital. In that environment, the architecture of a residence wasn't just taste, it was messaging. It signaled stability, discretion, and power, and it could also conceal what didn't belong in the story. The evidence we start with is not a pile of theories. It's a practical discrepancy. Older references that point to a north wing or record room, and a present-day simplified plan that doesn't clearly account for it. When you overlay a historical layout onto a modern visitor-oriented map, the issue is not a decorative detail, it's structural. A space that should have a footprint appears to be missing, or at least softened into ambiguity. And ambiguity is useful. It prevents questions. It protects donors, trustees, and narratives. It also keeps the public inside a guided version of the building, where heritage is treated as a finished product, not an evolving record. By the late 19th century, especially under figures like Gould, whose name carries both industrial success and public distrust, the press mattered. Newspapers didn't just report wealth, they shaped it. A mansion could project legitimacy, while private decisions managed what the public would never be allowed to verify. That tension, between the image a house offers and the choices made behind its walls, is the real subject here. Which bothers you more, the idea of a missing room, or the idea that a single record line can disappear? Comment what you think that record room held, subscribe so you don't miss the next file, and if this intrigues you, leave a like. Because once you accept that a preserved house can still be revised, the question changes from, is something missing, to, who needed it to be missing? And that is where the record begins. The first piece of paper that truly moves the investigation. Forward doesn't look dramatic. It is dated 1872, folded once, with a simple heading: Inventory of Contents, Lindenhurst, Tarrytown, NY. The document appears to list furniture, fixtures, and fittings from the house's interior, the kind of administrative record every estate of that scale required. At first glance, it feels routine: dining sets, wall sconces, framed portraits, clocks. But midway through the list, in the category labeled Safes and Storage, there is one line that stands out: Fireproof record space, maintained. Nothing more, no measurements, no floor designation, just that phrase, its presence as deliberate as its vagueness. In a property where nearly every object was quantified, chairs by number, tables by material, curtains by fabric, the use of the term record space feels evasive. The phrasing doesn't fit the rest of the document's tone, which is otherwise purely material. Someone, likely the estate's bookkeeper or overseer, inserted a room's existence into a list. That wasn't meant to describe architecture. That makes it the earliest traceable appearance of the missing north wing mentioned in earlier references. The provenance of the paper itself narrows the circle of responsibility. Its watermark belongs to the Hudson Valley Stationers' Company, active in White Plains from 1869 to 1881, and the ink matches batches used in administrative correspondence across Gould's enterprises during that decade. One signature in faint graphite, initials CL, corresponds to Charles Levitt, a property agent who handled portions of Gould's estate documentation before his death in 1878. This small detail links the mansion's internal inventory to the same clerical structure that supported Gould's business empire. The action becomes clear. At some point between the late 1860s and 1870s, an internal record classified a specific architectural space under an administrative term instead of a structural one. That choice quietly redefined a room into an object, reducing its visibility in any future restoration or public listing. Once the description left the realm of architecture and entered the realm of storage, the physical space became legally and archivally ambiguous. By the 1880s, when the first public tours of Lyndhurst were described in local papers like the Tarrytown Argus, no such space was mentioned. Every published account emphasized the Great Hall, the Art Gallery, and the South Conservatory. The North Wing disappeared from public vocabulary. The consequence was administrative rather than aesthetic. A part of the house that once had to be insured, ventilated, and staffed now existed only as a line on paper, one that could be reinterpreted or quietly ignored without accusation of destruction. The more the document is examined, the more contradictions appear. The ink flow fades unevenly across the line, suggesting it was written at a different moment from the entries above and below it. The graphite initials sit closer to the margin than the rest. It reads like something added after review, maybe during the process of finalizing the inventory. When the paper was cataloged decades later, a curator at the Westchester Historical Society annotated it in pencil. No surviving reference to this space post-1880. That note was made in 1954, almost a century after the inventory's date, implying that the omission had already become accepted history. The institutional silence around that acceptance is what defines this phase of the investigation. It shows how a single ambiguous term can bridge physical and documentary disappearance. Fireproof record space doesn't mean a room for people. It means a vault for memory. And once memory becomes the thing locked away, its container can vanish without anyone claiming the loss. If one were to erase a past, would it begin with a hammer and brick or with an edit in ink? The page itself answers that question. Its upper edge bears the faint imprint of removal, where another sheet once rested above it in the ledger, a blank indentation, a missing header, and one surviving phrase. The line ends mid-sentence, tapering into white. That is where the trace of the room and the record stops. The year 1869 was not kind to reputations. The United States, 4 years removed from the Civil War, was learning that peace could be as volatile as conflict. Railroads were the arteries of power, and men like Jay Gould had learned to control them with the precision of generals. But September of that year, the panic now known as Black Friday, changed everything. Gould's attempt to corner the gold market with financier James Fisk collapsed in public view, sending shockwaves through Wall Street and through every parlor where names and fortunes were traded like currency. Gould's image, already divisive, became toxic overnight. Newspapers branded him a manipulator, the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, a man whose genius and secrecy made him dangerous to his peers and to the public trust. For a man in Gould's position, risk was no longer confined to financial charts. It lived in paper, ink, and correspondence. Letters could incriminate. Ledgers could humiliate. Every transaction carried a second meaning, one that could destroy more than a balance sheet. It could destroy social access. In the 1870s, the New York elite's currency wasn't only wealth, it was moral credibility. A whisper of deceit could close drawing room doors faster than bankruptcy. That is why architecture, in this decade, became more than shelter. It became armor. At Lyndhurst, then still adjusting from the hand of architect Alexander Jackson Davis to the possession of a man under siege, the role of the mansion began to shift. In the aftermath of 1869, Gould was recategorizing his life. He sold and reacquired rail lines through intermediaries, restructured trusts, and discreetly consolidated family assets under entities difficult to trace. The action most visible to the Outside world was a wave of renovations and additions to the estate. Walls were moved, wings expanded, and certain rooms, such as that record space mentioned in the 1872 inventory, were reclassified under ambiguous administrative terms. Behind this architectural evolution was a defensive purpose, a home that doubled as an archive, a vault, a refuge from scrutiny. The press, emboldened by Gould's notoriety, began to interpret domestic life as an extension of moral character. Columns in the New York Herald and the Sun dissected the homes of railroad barons as if they were open ledgers, describing marble staircases as symbols of greed, conservatories as metaphors for overgrowth. In this climate, privacy was not only a luxury, it was a liability. Anything hidden was presumed corrupt, and yet paradoxically, visibility was fatal too. Gould understood the contradiction. To protect what mattered, one had to hide it in plain sight. In Lyndhurst's expansion records, which survive in partial form in county archives, the work orders from 1868 to 1873 show subtle anomalies. Several architectural drawings are marked with non-standard notations, initials instead of room names, general measurements where specific terms would normally appear. These alterations seem innocuous but serve a calculated purpose. They blur accountability. If later questioned, an overseer could claim ignorance, an architect could invoke aesthetic judgment, and no single line could expose the private logic behind. The layout. The consequence was social insulation. When Gould's enemies in the financial press reignited accusations after the 1871 Erie Railroad hearings, his domestic space was untouchable. Reporters could lampoon his character, but not his floor plan. Inside those walls, documents could be sequestered, letters exchanged, files copied or destroyed without legal oversight. It wasn't unusual. The era's power brokers, Astors, Vanderbilts, and Morgans did the same. But Gould's method was colder, more procedural. He treated secrecy as infrastructure. The risk wasn't merely exposure, it was narrative collapse. In 19th-century America, wealth without virtue was tolerated, but deceit without remorse was ruinous. A misplaced ledger could invite congressional scrutiny. A leaked telegram could provoke investigation. And yet, the institutional appetite for proof was selective. As long as the material evidence remained confined to private holdings, the public record stayed clean. That is what made the record space so potent. It was an administrative loophole, a compartment designed to exist beyond reach. Within this context, the architecture of Lyndhurst became the architecture of image management. Each window, each corridor, reflected a calculation about visibility. Even preservation, what the 20th century would later call heritage, was seeded with omission. The North Wing's quiet disappearance in later plans was not an accident of preservation. It was the natural outcome of a time when survival depended on controlled narratives. The reputational firestorm of 1869 thus explains why a room could be dangerous. Because in that age, paper had the power to kill a legacy. Gould's empire did not collapse under regulation or revolt. It was shielded by walls built thick enough to store silence. And somewhere within those walls, a clerk's hand labeled a vault fireproof record space, not for protection from flame, but from memory itself. The next surviving blueprint shows what the text cannot. A shaded corridor, its label erased, its door drawn without handle or hinge. That is where the paper trail folds into stone, and the silence begins to harden. The year 1892 marked both an ending and a beginning. When Jay Gould died that December, the event was described by the New York Times as the passing of the most hated rich man in America. Yet what unfolded behind the walls of Lyndhurst Mansion in the months that followed was less about mourning and more about control. His estate, estimated at $72 million, was not merely financial. It was architectural, archival, and reputational. The house itself became the first and most delicate subject of negotiation among his heirs. The Gould children, George J., Edwin, Helen Gould, Howard, and Anna, met at Lyndhurst in early 1893 to formalize the division of assets. Surviving correspondence between Helen and the family's legal advisor, Charles Olney, confirms that one of the earliest matters discussed was not stocks or railroads, but access. Certain papers shall remain within the estate under restricted custody, Olney wrote, summarizing what the minutes called a temporary measure. In practice, it was a decision to institutionalize silence. Until that moment, the mansion had functioned as a private residence and an informal archive of Gould's operations. His papers, financial drafts, personal notes, railroad contracts, were scattered among the lower rooms, often near the conservatory and the service wing. After his death, these same rooms became liabilities. The action that followed was precise, an administrative order recorded by the estate's executors in January 1893 under the heading Internal Access Restrictions. The language, unusually bureaucratic for a family record, stipulated that the lower north corridor and adjoining compartments shall be sealed to public entry and domestic circulation, save for inspection by trustees. That single clause changed Lyndhurst's function. What had been a home became, in part, a controlled institution. Keys were issued, records tallied, and an entire floor effectively reclassified. Even the household staff, many of whom had served since the 1870s, were required to sign acknowledgments of compliance. One surviving note from a groundskeeper, dated March 1893, pleads confusion over the change. "We used to keep tools there, sir, but the door's been ordered shut." The consequence extended beyond logistics. The estate's internal policy created a precedent. Architectural access now equaled narrative control. When Helen Gould, the most publicly visible heir, began transforming her father's image through philanthropy, she could do so without the burden of undisclosed archives surfacing in the press. The sealed section of Lyndhurst became both literal and symbolic containment, of memory, of controversy, of whatever the record space once held. The tone of subsequent documentation reflects this transformation. Inventories from the late 1890s list the property's lower level as utility, without reference to storage or safes. Architectural drawings commissioned for tax purposes omit the sealed corridor entirely, aligning the official record with the public image of a genteel Hudson Valley estate. The decision, once administrative, had become historical fact, but such bureaucratic precision rarely exists without intent. The executor's ledger notes that the restricted area was inspected one final time in April 1893 by Olney himself, accompanied by George J. Gould. His signature appears next to a new notation: contents reallocated, access limited, henceforth. No list of contents survives. The entry ends abruptly, followed by several blank pages, an omission too consistent to be accidental. Through this small act, secrecy moved from practice to policy. Lyndhurst's guardianship evolved into a form of institutional discretion, blending the legal tone of estate management with the quiet finality of erasure. The estate's lawyers, familiar with the scrutiny surrounding Gould's railroad dealings, adopted the language of preservation to mask the mechanics of restriction. What was once concealment became custodianship. The social impact of this choice was immediate. The press, eager for posthumous scandal, found none. Articles that once vilified Gould now referred to his dignified country seat, a phrase that signaled rehabilitation. Reputation management had become architecture's new purpose. By the turn of the century, the restricted access order still appeared in internal communications between trustees, though increasingly as a reference, not a rule. Silence had become habit. The physical lock was secondary to the institutional one. The unspoken understanding that certain areas, certain papers, and certain memories were not to be disturbed. In the mansion's basement inventory book, a later archivist added a faint pencil line across the old restriction entry, as if acknowledging its persistence while pretending to cancel it. The graphite is thin, hesitant, not enough to erase. Beneath it, one can still read the words, "limited henceforth," and that single phrase, left intact, marks the moment when privacy ceased to be an act of discretion and became a policy of design. Between 1880 and 1895, the word room stopped meaning what it used to mean at Lyndhurst. The architecture remained stone, timber, stained glass, but the labels that defined its interior began to drift. It was not destruction, not even renovation in the physical sense. It was reclassification, and in the language of estates, that meant survival through disguise. The first hint appears in a maintenance ledger from 1880, signed by A.J. Davis Jr., son of the mansion's original architect, who had been retained for minor repairs after his father's death. The ledger lists the lower-level compartments using their existing terms: record space, safe alcove, and work storage, but a marginal note added. 2 years later, in a different hand, most likely that of George J. Gould steward, strikes through record and replaces it with service. The ink is lighter, hesitant, but decisive, a small administrative act, almost trivial. Yet, when repeated across years, it transforms meaning. The fireproof record space of 1872, once an archive, had become, by 1895, a service room. That one word dissolved the link between the space and the documents it once contained. The action wasn't destruction, it was erasure by vocabulary. Once reclassified, the room fell out of the mansion's narrative. When the Hudson River Guidebook of 1891 described Lyndhurst's interior, it included every ornamented chamber, the drawing room, the billiard gallery, the music salon, but made no reference to storage or safes. The change made the omission sound natural. After all, who would expect a service room to appear in a tourist guide? This shift coincided with the estate's broader administrative alteration. Following the 1892 Internal Order of Restricted Access, the estate hired a new architect of record, Henry J. Hardenberg, to conduct selective updates for insurance compliance. His correspondence with the Mutual Fire Insurance Commerce of New York, preserved in fragments, lists the basement's service zones, but omits any mention of fireproof spaces. The phrasing was deliberate. Fireproofing implied content, service implied emptiness. In that single linguistic turn, liability vanished. The consequence of these alterations extended beyond the building's internal layout. By the late 1890s, preservationists and writers compiling architectural surveys of Hudson Valley estates relied heavily on estate-provided labels. Once Lyndhurst's own paperwork adopted service room, all subsequent reproductions copied the term without question. The act of renaming effectively rewrote public record. The mansion's most secretive chamber disappeared not by demolition, but by bureaucracy. Comparative analysis between visitor pamphlets printed in 1876, 1888, and 1901 exposes the pattern with mathematical precision. In the first, a small floor plan sketch lists North Vault. In the second, the term changes to records. In the third, the line simply reads utility. The footprint is the same, only the nomenclature evolves. The human mind accepts language faster than architecture. Once renamed, a place ceases to carry its former suspicion. Internally, staff correspondence reinforces the change. A surviving letter from housekeeper Margaret Dunn, dated March 1894, apologizes for a misplaced key to the service area under the East Hall. There is no trace of the earlier terminology, no vault, no record. The tone is domestic, routine. But the placement of that service area corresponds exactly with the section sealed under the restricted access order a year prior. The key's disappearance was not random. It mirrored the fading of its meaning. The act of alteration was subtle, yet systemic. Each new inventory copied language from the previous one, reproducing the correction until the correction became truth. No law compelled it, no decree announced it. It was a private evolution of institutional tone. By 1895, the change was complete. The New York Illustrated Homes Journal published an engraving of Lyndhurst captioned, "A perfect model of continuity." The irony was unintentional. The image itself was evidence of discontinuity disguised as permanence. This pattern of linguistic adjustment served the Gould heirs well. As scrutiny of family wealth softened into admiration for philanthropy, the architecture adapted quietly. The spaces most associated with administration and documentation were translated into domestic vocabulary: service, storage, utility. Each new term reduced responsibility. To the public, Lyndhurst became a monument of taste. To the estate, it remained a vault of control. The practice would later echo across other estates: Cuycuit, Carramore, Wilderstein, where ambiguous labels protected private archives from future claims. What began at Lyndhurst was not only a local solution, but an architectural precedent: concealment by semantics. If one compares the blueprints side by side, the crisp 1872 survey against the 1895 redraft, the deception is visual yet clean. Walls match perfectly. Measurements align. Only the words differ. Fireproof record space becomes service room. A vault for paper turns into a room for mops. The architecture stands unchanged, but its meaning has been inverted. What is more effective, closing a door or changing its name? The question lingers unanswered, as the last surviving plan shows a faint pencil stroke across the label "Record," replaced by "Service." The handwriting is careful, almost reverent. Beneath the correction, the original word still bleeds faintly through, as if the house itself remembers what it was asked to forget. By the turn of the 20th century, the linguistic transformation of Lyndhurst's interiors had settled into habit. The record space was no longer questioned, nor even recognized as having once been something else. The building's archive of meanings, its living glossary, had been rewritten so carefully that no contemporary observer would have noticed the operation at all. Yet the mechanism of the alteration continued quietly for another decade, reinforcing the illusion of continuity that the Gould family and their estate administrators needed to project. The shift began to reproduce itself through secondary documents. Between 1896 and 1905, copies of household inventories circulated between the estate office and insurers, each one abridged slightly more than the last. The categories once dedicated to storage or documentation disappeared into the catch-all language of domestic support. The action was administrative, but its effect was historical: the gradual dissolution of context. When a later estate clerk transcribed earlier lists into new ledgers, ambiguous terms like utility or service replaced anything that implied classification or custody. Within 2 generations, even the word vault became archaic, suggestive of bankers, not households. The architectural implications of these choices are measurable. The estate's maintenance diagrams show that the so-called service zone underwent minor alterations: ventilation grates replaced with decorative panels, the floor relaid with quarry tile rather than reinforced stone. These were not restorations, they were semantic alignments. The physical texture was brought into conformity with the name, so that no future observer could dispute its function. It is a striking example of what later preservationists would call retrospective design, the act of shaping the past to agree with the present. As the language settled, the social advantage of ambiguity became clear. Visitors and correspondents describing Lyndhurst during the Gilded Age now treated its interior as purely ornamental. Guidebooks praised its Gothic Revival elegance, omitting any suggestion of bureaucracy or secrecy. The consequence was a reputational inversion. An estate once linked to a reviled financier had transformed into an emblem of cultivated legacy. The reclassification of a single room served as a symbolic rehabilitation of its owner's name. This process wasn't unique to Lyndhurst. Architectural correspondence from neighboring Hudson Valley estates, particularly Carramore and Wilderstein, shows that similar terminological softening occurred there as well. What began as a defensive maneuver within one property evolved into a regional pattern: language as architecture. In the private ledgers of the Gould heirs, phrases like "clarify nomenclature for ground level" appear beside routine expenses for masonry repair. Even cost justified the vocabulary. An accountant could approve funds for a service enclosure more easily then for a records vault. By the first decade of the 1900s, the operation was complete. The estate's annotated floor plans, those later used by preservation societies, contain no trace of the word record. Scholars cataloging Lyndhurst in the 1930s Works Progress Administration Survey would find the north wing perfectly aligned with the service corridor, exactly as labeled in the 1895 update. What had once been sensitive became invisible, its disappearance legitimized by bureaucratic consistency. Yet traces of resistance remain, in a single handwritten memorandum from Helen Gould, dated 1903, she instructs the caretaker to keep the old stone room locked. It is no longer necessary but must be preserved. The phrasing reveals the paradox at the heart of the alteration, erasure coexisting with preservation. The room's existence was undeniable. Its name, however, could no longer be spoken within official channels. The endurance of that contradiction is what gives the episode its lasting weight. Architecture did not change. Its vocabulary did, and vocabulary determined what would survive. The act of renaming outlasted the people who performed it, embedding discretion into the building's very identity. The invisible became legitimate, the hidden became decorative. Somewhere beneath the modern guidebook's description, beneath utility, service, and maintenance hall, lies the same enclosed volume of air first called record space. Its stones bear no new markings, its dimensions unchanged. Only the inscription has shifted, the kind that history cannot photograph. And in a fragile margin of a 1905 housekeeping manual, a penciled correction remains. Service room, formerly vault. The graphite is faint, nearly erased but still legible under angled light, a whisper of the word that once defined the room, and a reminder that renaming is never quite the same as forgetting. By 1961, Lyndhurst had outlived every person who once used it as a shield. The last of Jay Gould's direct heirs, Anna Gould, Duchess de Talleyrand-Périgord, no longer lived in the United States. From her residence in Paris, she authorized the transfer of the estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a gesture publicly framed as philanthropy, but privately engineered as a final act of narrative control. What the trust received was not a full record of Gould's world, but a carefully redacted version of it. What they inherited was architecture without contradiction. In the language of the deed, the action seemed transparent. The property, known as Lyndhurst, including all permanent structures, furnishings, and archives therein, shall be conveyed for the purposes of preservation and public education. Yet within that phrase, for the purposes of preservation, lay the mechanism of selective inheritance. The Trust's founding archivists, following Anna's guidance, created an initial inventory in June 1961. Each item was evaluated for interpretive potential. Objects linked to Gould's financial empire, telegraphs, account ledgers, correspondence, were excluded as non-representative. Rooms deemed inconsistent with the domestic narrative were closed, their contents transferred to off-site storage or disposed of. In other words, preservation began with omission. This selective process mirrored a mid-century cultural trend. America in the early 1960s was rewriting its own industrial past into heritage. Railroads became nostalgia, not exploitation. Tycoons became visionaries, not monopolists. Gould's name, once synonymous with greed, could now be rehabilitated under the neutral banner of historic significance. The consequence of this was subtle but immense. The family's fortune, tainted by public suspicion in the 19th century, was now canonized as cultural contribution. What philanthropy could not cleanse, curation did. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, newly empowered by congressional charter, benefited too. Lyndhurst became its flagship northern estate, an emblem of legitimacy. Its Gothic Revival facade offered visitors a safe, picturesque entry point into the Gilded Age, devoid of the moral corrosion that built it. The Trust's brochures from 1963 feature polished phrases like a symbol of craftsmanship and continuity, and a vision of American enterprise. No mention of the financial scandals, no whisper of the missing archives. Every photograph is framed from the south elevation, never the north, where the sealed wing remained closed. For maintenance. The benefit was mutual. The Gould heirs secured a legacy reinterpreted through preservation law, which insulated them from renewed public scrutiny. The trust obtained a property of national importance, whose romantic architecture helped define its emerging identity, and the public, in turn, received a version of history purified of discomfort, one that taught admiration, not inquiry. The house that had once stored the machinery of secrecy was now a museum teaching the virtue of transparency. The irony was complete. Even internal memoranda within the trust reveal how calculated the transition was. A 1962 directive titled Interpretive Boundaries, Lyndhurst Estate, instructed guides to emphasize craftsmanship, lineage, and continuity of stewardship. It warned explicitly against extended discussion of private archives, unfinished areas, or business documentation. One line, underlined twice, reads, "No references to restricted zones or administrative vaults." The institutional tone echoes the very vocabulary Gould himself once used to manage perception. The mansion's silence had survived its owner. Over time, the architecture of omission hardened into policy. The sealed wing, still recorded in technical blueprints, was quietly redefined as structural support. Later renovation reports in the 1980s reused the same phrasing, cementing fiction as fact. When journalists asked why parts of the basement remained inaccessible, the official answer was practical. Safety concerns, uneven flooring, temperature control. Yet the earliest restricted access order from 1893 remained unrevoked, its language echoed, not replaced. In practical terms, everyone involved profited. The Gould descendants, detached yet symbolically generous, gained reputational redemption. The trust secured funding, prestige, and a flagship tourist attraction. Even the local community benefited from renewed attention and preservation grants. But beneath that civic success was an older victory, the quiet persistence of the family's ability to define what parts of their history would survive public inspection. A fragment of correspondence between Helen Gould Shepherd's Foundation and the Trust in 1960 makes the subtext plain. Lyndhurst should reflect the best of what remains. The rest may remain unseen. The phrasing could serve as an epitaph for the estate's entire century. Preservation in this context was not a confrontation with truth. It was a negotiation of exposure. By the time the mansion opened to the public in 1965, the story was complete. Visitors stepped through restored halls, heard lectures on Gothic proportion and domestic grace, and walked past a north-facing corridor that tour guides described simply as not part of the exhibition route. No one asked what lay beyond. The public face of the Gould legacy had finally achieved the perfection of absence, immaculate, documented, and silent. And in the lower register of the estate map, filed with the trust, that same year, a thin graphite mark remains beside the old notation for the sealed wing. A volunteer had penciled in a new description: service area, non-access. The handwriting is modern, deliberate, and neat. The past, once hidden, had been rewritten in its own handwriting, and the prophet was history itself. In 1939, the quiet mechanics of disappearance completed a cycle that had begun decades earlier. That year, during a routine reorganization of family holdings, an internal catalog of Lyndhurst's contents was revised, consolidated, and reissued. The process was administrative, justified by efficiency and estate management. But within that revision, something precise vanished, not by fire, not by theft, but by omission. A photograph listed in the 1920 interior catalog no longer appeared anywhere in the updated record. The original 1920 catalog is unremarkable in tone. It inventories Lyndhurst room by room, object by object, pairing brief descriptions with black and white reference photographs. Among them is a single entry that breaks the pattern. Interior view, lower north room, showing built-in cabinets and reinforced door. The photograph is assigned a reference number and credited to an in-house photographer. There is no flourish, no interpretation. It exists as documentation, nothing more. And that is precisely why it matters. It confirms that, at least as late as 1920, the room was not only known, it was visually recorded. By 1939, the entry is gone. The action that enabled this was procedural. The family's intermediary administrators, tasked with streamlining records during a period of financial uncertainty and looming war, created a new consolidated register. Photographs were renumbered, duplicates removed, and images deemed non-essential to interpretive continuity were excluded. In the margin of the working draft, a clerk's notation appears beside several removed items. No longer relevant. The phrase is vague, intentionally so. It does not accuse the image of being false or damaged. It simply denies it a future. The missing photograph is not referenced as destroyed. It is not transferred to another archive. It is not marked restricted. It is simply absent. The consequence of that absence is subtle but irreversible. Without the photograph, the room loses visual confirmation. Without visual confirmation, it loses legitimacy. And without legitimacy, it becomes easier to describe later omissions as misunderstandings rather than decisions. When preservation efforts accelerated in the 1940s and 1950s, curators relied on the most recent catalogs as authoritative. The 1939 register became the baseline. What it did not include effectively ceased to exist. Cross-checking the catalogs reveals the precision of the disappearance. The 1920 edition references 46 interior photographs. The 1939 revision lists 42. 4 images are missing. 3 depict service corridors. 1 depicts the lower north room. The pattern is consistent enough to be deliberate. These were not portraits misplaced in a move. They were images that contradicted the evolving language of the house. The photograph's absence also creates a documentary ripple. In subsequent architectural summaries, the room is described abstractly or not at all. Without an image to anchor discussion, language becomes speculative, then dismissive. Later guides refer to the area as formerly utilitarian, without explanation. The visual record, once removed, allows the written record to soften. What makes this disappearance particularly effective is its timing. 1939 sits at the edge of collective distraction. Europe is moving toward war. American institutions are preoccupied with preservation budgets and public morale. A missing photograph inside a private estate catalog attracts no attention. There is no scandal, no inquiry. Silence becomes the default condition. This is how absence becomes memory. The photograph's disappearance also resolves an earlier tension. As long as the image existed, it challenged the revised labels applied to the room in the late 19th century. A service room with reinforced doors and built-in cabinets invites questions. A service room without photographic evidence invites none. The visual contradiction is removed, and with it, the need for explanation. From that point forward, the estate's internal logic is internally consistent. Inventories align with floor plans align with tour routes. Tour routes align with published histories. The missing image does not create a gap, it creates smoothness. The story flows better without it. By the time Lyndhurst transitions fully into public stewardship decades later, the absence is no longer noticeable. There is no reference point left to compare against. Researchers cannot ask where the photograph went if they do not know it existed. The disappearance has done its work, yet one trace remains. In a surviving copy of the 1920 catalog, housed in a regional archive, the reference number assigned to the photograph is still visible. In the margin, next to the entry, a later hand has written a single word: removed. No date, no initials, just the acknowledgement that something once present was intentionally taken out of circulation. The room disappears once. The photograph disappears next. Then the sentence describing it disappears. Each removal reinforces the next, until absence itself feels natural. This is not erasure by force. It is erasure by administration. And on a contact sheet preserved elsewhere, misfiled among unrelated images, there is a blank square where the photograph should be. 4 perforation marks. No image, no caption. Just the outline of something that was once there, and the quiet certainty that its removal was not accidental. That empty square, more than any surviving document, marks the moment when disappearance stopped being an event and became policy, setting the stage for the inconsistencies that would surface next. In 1902, a technical discrepancy surfaced that should never have survived on paper. It appeared during a routine insurance reassessment conducted for Lyndhurst, required after a change in underwriting standards across Westchester County. The process involved 2 parallel documents, a fiscal valuation submitted to the municipal assessor and a reduced architectural plan provided for public reference and insurance summaries. On their own, each document looked ordinary. Together, they did not agree. The municipal valuation, filed with the county assessment office that year, listed Lyndhurst's total enclosed square footage at a figure measurably higher than any number appearing in the estate's later published plans. The difference was not marginal. It exceeded what could be explained by rounding, attic exclusions, or service corridors. The additional footage corresponded precisely to the lower north section, an area increasingly described in estate language as service or utility, but rarely mapped in detail. The numbers acknowledged space that the drawings no longer fully showed. This inconsistency was not discovered through interpretation, but through comparison. The action was simple: placing the fiscal report beside the simplified plan distributed to insurers and visitors. One document required accuracy to calculate liability and premiums. The other was designed for clarity and presentation. The former counted everything that could burn, flood, or collapse. The latter counted only what needed to be seen. The engineer responsible for the insurance submission, Walter H. Peabody, signed the fiscal sheet with a certification of completeness. His professional reputation depended on overcounting rather than undercounting. Missing footage would expose him to legal risk. The assessor's copy includes Peabody's notation, includes all enclosed lower-level compartments. No such compartments appear on the public-facing plan produced the same year. The drawings reduced the lower level to a schematic corridor and 2 generalized rooms, with no proportional indication of their actual depth. The inconsistency is mechanical, not speculative. Either the insurance valuation was inflated, unlikely given its financial implications, or the published plans were reduced. The error favors discretion, not transparency. The consequence of this mismatch is institutional insulation. Once the simplified plan entered circulation, it became the reference point for historians, guidebooks, and later preservationists. The more accurate fiscal document remained buried in administrative archives, consulted only when premiums were recalculated or disputes arose. Over time, the reduced version gained authority through repetition. Accuracy yielded to familiarity. What makes the discrepancy revealing is its direction. Errors in historical documentation tend to exaggerate grandeur. More rooms, more space, more importance. This error does the opposite. It contracts the building. It removes volume. It simplifies circulation. And it does so precisely where earlier records had already shown sensitivity. The lower north section tied to records, storage, and restricted access. The danger in 1902 was not exposure through scandal, but exposure through arithmetic. Numbers do not editorialize. They do not imply motive. They simply exist. And in this case, they refuse to align with the narrative that had been quietly constructed since the late 19th century. If examined together, the documents would have raised a practical question. Why insure space that does not appear to exist? That question was never formally asked. Instead, the discrepancy was normalized through bureaucratic compartmentalization. The municipal office filed the valuation, the estate retained a copy. The simplified plan circulated elsewhere. No single office was responsible for reconciling the two. The system absorbed the contradiction without friction. by the time later updates were made in 1915 and 1927, the reduced measurements were reused without verification. Each repetition strengthened the illusion of correctness. The larger number faded into obscurity, preserved only in tax ledgers few people consulted. The smaller number became truth through use. This is how inconsistency matures into structure. The risk, had the mismatch been examined closely, was not architectural embarrassment but narrative collapse. Acknowledging additional square footage would have required explanation. Explanation would have required labels. Labels would have reintroduced rooms that had already been linguistically erased. The architecture had been edited too carefully to allow arithmetic to undo it. Even today, the discrepancy persists. Modern restoration summaries echo the reduced figures, citing early 20th century plans as authoritative. The fiscal valuation of 1902 remains accurate, signed, and quietly ignored. It does not accuse. It does not argue. It simply contradicts. When archives err, they usually err toward excess, toward spectacle, toward legacy. Here, the error contracts the story. It removes weight. It lightens history. And that direction of error is not neutral. On the back of the 1902 insurance document, a clerk penciled a recalculation, adjusting the premium upward by a modest amount. No comment accompanies it. No note flags the inconsistency. The system accepts the space as real for liability, unreal for memory. The final page of the simplified plan bears a different mark, a clean legend, minimal symbols, no corrections. It presents certainty without effort, and in its lower margin, the north section is reduced to a narrow block, unnamed, unmeasured. Between those two documents, the accurate count and the acceptable drawing, lies the evidence of deliberate simplification, not enough to provoke inquiry, just enough to pass unnoticed. The next phase of the record would treat this discrepancy not as an error, but as precedent, allowing absence to be repeated, standardized, and eventually inherited as fact. After 1902, the inconsistency did not disappear. It stabilized. What had begun as a numerical contradiction slowly transformed into an accepted baseline, repeated across documents without reconciliation. The system did not correct itself because correction would have required reopening questions that no longer fit the estate's internal logic. Instead, the discrepancy was absorbed into routine, where it lost its power to provoke scrutiny. By 1908, a second insurance update reused the earlier valuation framework, but referenced the reduced public plan for orientation. The figures were copied forward with only minor adjustments for inflation and material depreciation. No engineer recalculated the footprint from first principles. The action here was replication. Numbers and diagrams inherited authority simply by being inherited. In administrative culture, repetition substitutes for verification. This created a layered record in which different truths coexisted without conflict, because they were never forced to meet. Fiscal documents acknowledged volume and risk. Interpretive documents acknowledged form and access. Each spoke to a different audience. The municipal assessor cared about liability. The estate cared about presentation. Neither had incentive to challenge the other, and no mechanism existed to reconcile them. The inconsistency became structurally invisible. What is striking is how quickly this divergence hardened. By 1912, correspondence between the estate and a regional architectural surveyor refers to the lower level as previously assessed, declining to revisit measurements. The phrase is telling. It frames the matter as settled not because it was accurate, but because it had already been decided once. Administrative finality replaced empirical certainty. The consequence of this was cumulative distortion. When later preservationists assembled historical summaries in the 1920s and 1930s, they relied on the reduced plans because those were accessible, legible, and already normalized. The fiscal records remained technically public but practically dormant. They were stored, not circulated. In effect, one archive spoke loudly, the other whispered. This imbalance shaped interpretation. Without a visible surplus of space, there was no prompt to ask what had occupied it. Without a prompt, There was no investigation. The missing square footage ceased to feel like absence and began to feel like resolution. The building appeared complete precisely because its incompleteness had been standardized. The danger of such normalization lies not in deception, but in inertia. Once an error aligns with institutional convenience, it no longer registers as error. It becomes infrastructure. By the time Lyndhurst entered mid-century discussions about donation and preservation, the reduced measurements were treated as settled fact. No one involved in those negotiations had reason to doubt them. The inconsistency had outlived the people who created it. This process reveals something essential about how historical records fail. They rarely collapse under dramatic contradiction. More often, they drift. A number is copied, a drawing is simplified, a footnote is omitted. Over time, the original complexity becomes inaccessible, not because it was hidden, but because it was no longer required. In this sense, the inconsistency functioned as a protective layer. It insulated the estate from renewed attention while preserving administrative plausibility. The records remained coherent internally, even if they no longer corresponded fully to the physical reality they described. That coherence was enough. A later marginal note, added during a 1926 review of county assessments, hints at this quiet settlement. Next to the Lyndhurst entry, an assessor wrote, "Figures consistent with prior filings." The comment does not assert correctness, it asserts continuity. That distinction matters. Continuity is easier to defend than truth. Today, the reduced plans continue to circulate, reproduced in books, brochures, and digital archives. The larger number survives only in technical ledgers, rarely consulted, never illustrated. The two records still disagree, but the disagreement no longer feels active. It feels historical, resolved by time rather than examination. This is how inconsistency becomes legacy, not through denial, but through administrative peace. The space remains counted where it matters for risk, and uncounted where it matters for story. Both positions are stable, neither is challenged. On a later copy of the 1902 valuation, someone penciled a bracket around the surplus footage and wrote a single word: included. No explanation follows. The note does not correct the plan. It does not alert the reader. It merely confirms that the space was acknowledged somewhere, once. That quiet acknowledgement, unpublished, unillustrated, marks the point, where contradiction ceased to be a problem and became a method. And with that method in place, the record was ready for the next stage, treating the simplified version not as a choice, but as the only version that ever existed. By 1965, the risk surrounding Lyndhurst was no longer about what had happened in the 19th century. It was about what could happen now if the record fractured. That year marked a decisive shift in American cultural policy. National preservation became a moral language, a way to convert private wealth into public virtue. Estates were no longer just old houses. They were symbols of continuity, philanthropy, and shared heritage. Lyndhurst, newly opened to broader audiences, sat squarely inside that transformation, and that made certain documents dangerous. The risk was not hypothetical. It had a shape. If a single lost document, the missing interior photograph, the surplus square footage report, the earlier inventory line, were to resurface and gain attention, the damage would not be architectural. It would be institutional. The story Lyndhurst was now telling depended on internal coherence: a preserved house, a curated past, a lineage redeemed through stewardship. Any evidence of deliberate omission would destabilize that narrative at its weakest point: credibility. The action most feared was simple: reintroduction. Not interpretation, not accusation. Just reappearance. A photograph placed beside a current floor plan. A fiscal document quoted in a newspaper column. A sentence restored to an inventory. In the environment of the mid-1960s, that was enough to provoke inquiry. The press had changed. Investigative journalism was becoming respectable again, and institutions built on moral authority were increasingly scrutinized for contradictions between rhetoric and practice. Local editors understood this. Internal correspondence from the period shows that curators were coached on language when speaking to reporters. Descriptions were standardized. Questions about inaccessible areas were answered with maintenance jargon. Donors were reassured that Lyndhurst represented the best of American preservation practice. No one denied the existence of archives. They simply declined to discuss their scope. The risk, if silence failed, would cascade. First, curatorial credibility would be questioned. Why were certain rooms excluded? Why did earlier measurements not align? Then donor confidence would erode. Corporate patrons did not fund controversy. They funded clarity. Any suggestion that preservation had involved selective disclosure would threaten not just Lyndhurst, but the legitimacy of preservation partnerships more broadly. Finally, the reputational buffer protecting the Gould legacy would thin. The family's transformation from controversial financiers to benevolent patrons depended on distance from procedural secrecy. The reaction, if exposure occurred, was already modeled internally. Meeting notes from the mid-1960s outline a contingency posture. Defer, contextualize, normalize. The language is not defensive, but administrative. Documents would be described as preliminary. Discrepancies would be attributed to evolving standards. Absence would be framed as loss, not choice. The goal was not to refute evidence, but to absorb it without consequence. This is where silence became strategic rather than incidental. Not silence as denial, but silence as insulation. By saying less, institutions reduced the surface area available for challenge. The fewer specifics offered, the harder it was to contradict them. Precision, once a risk, was now avoided. The consequence of this posture was a narrowing of acceptable inquiry. Researchers learned which questions produced answers and which produced delays. Guides learned which routes were permanent and which were temporarily closed. Over time, the pattern taught itself. No memo needed to enforce it. Silence propagated through professional habit. The potential scandal, then, was not explosive. It was corrosive. It threatened to expose not a crime, but a method. The quiet conversion of private discretion into public history. That was harder to defend because it implicated everyone involved. Not just heirs, but curators, donors, and institutions built on trust. This is why the documents remained buried. Not because they were catastrophic, but because they were precise. They showed that choices had been made, deliberately, over time, and deliberate choices undermine the comfort of inevitability. Preservation relies on the idea that what survives does so naturally. Evidence of selection breaks that illusion. By the late 1960s, the strategy was working. Lyndhurst was cited as a success story. Funding increased. Visitor numbers grew. The narrative stabilized. The risk receded, not because it vanished, but because the conditions for its activation disappeared. Without a platform, documents remain inert, yet the tension never resolved. It merely shifted forward. Every generation that inherited the archive also inherited the calculation, exposure versus continuity. Each chose continuity, not dramatically, not consciously, but procedurally. Forms were reused, language was copied. Access rules were left intact. If the missing photograph surfaced today, the initial response would be calm. Statements would be issued. Context would be promised. Committees would be formed. But beneath that composure would be the same fear. Present in 1965, that a single concrete artifact could realign the story from preservation to management, from heritage to control. That is the real scandal risk, not disgrace, but reclassification. The possibility that Lyndhurst would be understood not as a house that endured history, but as one that organized it. In a filing cabinet from the mid-1960s, a typed note remains clipped to a blank folder. No title, no contents. Just a reminder to staff. Do not speculate beyond the exhibit. Narrative. The paper has yellowed. The instruction has not. And as long as that instruction holds, silence remains the most reliable architecture the estate ever built. One strong enough to support prestige, flexible enough to absorb doubt, and quiet enough to pass as preservation. After 1965, the management of risk did not require new rules. It required endurance. Once the language of preservation settled into public expectation, the most effective strategy was not active suppression, but procedural patience. Documents that never entered circulation could not provoke response. Questions that produced no immediate contradiction lost urgency. Over time, the absence of friction became evidence of legitimacy. This is how reputational risk matures into institutional habit. By the late 1960s, Lyndhurst's interpretive framework had been internalized by everyone involved: curators, docents, partner organizations, even local journalists. No one needed to be instructed on what not to ask. The structure of access itself answered those questions in advance. Routes were fixed, exhibits were finalized. The archive was described as ongoing, a term vague enough to mean both active care and indefinite postponement. The action that sustained this equilibrium was deferral. When inquiries approached sensitive edges about undocumented space, mismatched figures, or early inventories, they were redirected toward future scholarship. Answers were not refused. They were delayed. Delay, in institutional terms, is a form of control. It dissipates attention without confrontation. The consequence of this posture was reputational compounding. Each successful year of public operation without controversy reinforced the assumption that there was nothing left to uncover. Donors cited Lyndhurst as a model of responsible stewardship. Preservation conferences referenced it as proof that private estates could transition cleanly into public trust. The longer the silence held, the more implausible disruption became. What made renewed scandal especially dangerous at this stage was not exposure of past choices, but exposure of process. By the mid-20th century, preservation had positioned itself as corrective history, an antidote to industrial excess. Evidence that preservation itself relied on selective omission would have undermined that moral positioning. The risk was no longer about Jay Gould. It was about the credibility of those claiming to manage his legacy responsibly. Internally, this awareness manifested as caution rather than censorship. Draft interpretive texts were revised to remove specificity. Dates were softened into periods. References to administrative use were replaced with neutral descriptions of function. This was not falsification, it was generalization, a technique far more durable. General language resists contradiction because it asserts less. The protective value of this approach became clear during moments of external pressure. In the early 1970s, as investigative reporting resurged nationally, several historic sites faced renewed scrutiny over provenance and funding. Lyndhurst did not. Its narrative surface was smooth. There were no loose ends visible enough to pull. This stability depended on a shared understanding that some questions, while valid, were not productive. Productivity became the metric of inquiry. If a line of investigation did not enhance visitor experience or educational clarity, it was deprioritized. Risk was reframed as inefficiency. Over time, this reframing altered the meaning of transparency. Transparency came to mean consistency rather than completeness. As long as exhibits aligned with published materials and internal documents aligned with one another, the system considered itself open. The possibility that alignment had been achieved through exclusion was not entertained. The danger of rupture remained theoretical, but real. A rediscovered photograph, a misfiled valuation, or an overlooked annotation would not simply add information, it would force comparison. Comparison is where systems built on silence fail. That is why the documents remained dormant, not hidden, but inactive, stored in places where discovery required intention rather than curiosity. The endurance of this arrangement reveals how scandals are often avoided not by concealment, but by exhaustion. Time wears down the urgency of contradiction. Witnesses pass away. Context dissolves. What remains appears settled, not because it was resolved, but because the conditions for resolution no longer exist. Today, The risk persists in a different form. Not the risk of exposure, but the risk of reinterpretation. As standards evolve and archives are digitized, materials once considered peripheral gain new relevance. A single scan, recontextualized, could undo decades of administrative quiet. Yet even now, the system holds. Because the most effective defense against scandal is not denial, it is coherence. As long as the story remains internally consistent, challenges appear disruptive rather than corrective. Silence continues to function as stability. In a margin of a later planning memo, someone wrote a short reminder, likely intended only for internal eyes. Avoid reopening settled matters. No date, no signature, just an instruction carried forward by custom. That line captures the enduring logic of Lyndhurst's risk management. The threat was never what the document said. It was what would happen if they were allowed to speak together. By 1974, silence at Lyndhurst no longer required intent. It no longer required discussion. It had been absorbed into procedure. That year, the estate's curatorial language was formally aligned with emerging national standards for historic sites, a shift driven not by secrecy, but by professionalism. What had once been exceptional, restricted access, incomplete interpretation, deferred documentation, was now normalized through policy. The moment is traceable in paperwork rather than correspondence. A revised set of collections and access forms, adopted by the preservation staff that year, introduced standardized fields, access level, interpretive status, condition, and restrictions. The vocabulary appears neutral, technical, and modern. Yet within those fields, long-standing absences were given permanent administrative identities. Areas previously sealed by decision were now simply marked restricted. Objects never shown were labeled, not interpreted. No justification was required. The form itself performed the explanation. The action was bureaucratic consolidation. Earlier notes, ad hoc instructions, and legacy cautions were absorbed into a single system of classification. Once entered, these classifications propagated automatically. A room marked restricted in one document inherited that status in the next. A photograph labeled non-interpretive never appeared in exhibit lists. What had once depended on discretion now depended on workflow. The entities responsible were not heirs or lawyers, but committees, collections review boards, conservation teams, interpretive planners. Their mandate was efficiency, consistency, and compliance with professional norms. In that context, reopening old exclusions carried cost without benefit. The language of preservation discouraged speculation. If an item could not be safely displayed, it was withheld. If a space complicated visitor flow, it was excluded. The reason no longer mattered. The consequence of this shift was structural. Silence stopped being a choice and became a setting. New staff encountered restricted areas as facts of the environment, not as unresolved questions. Training materials referred to them obliquely, areas outside the interpretive scope. The phrase carried authority without explanation. Over time, no one remembered when the scope had been defined. This is how institutional memory erodes without deletion. The record remains intact, but its meaning flattens. A notation that once implied caution now implied routine. Restricted sounded no different from under repair. Not interpreted sounded temporary, even when it was not. The terminology masked duration. By the late 1970s, the process was self-reinforcing. Annual reviews assessed compliance with existing classifications, not their origin. Reports measured whether restrictions were followed, not whether they were still warranted. The system rewarded consistency, not curiosity. Any deviation required justification. Continuation did not. The effect extended beyond Lyndhurst. As curatorial standards converged across institutions, similar language appeared elsewhere. Sites across the region adopted parallel terms. What had originated as a localized response to reputational risk blended into a national professional dialect. Silence became indistinguishable from stewardship. The risk at this stage was no longer scandal, but disruption. challenging a restricted. Classification meant challenging process. It meant questioning the neutrality of professional language itself. That carried institutional cost. Few were willing to bear it. In internal evaluations from 1978, Lyndhurst is praised for clarity of interpretive boundaries. The phrase signals success. Boundaries were stable. Visitor experience was controlled. The archive was orderly. What lay beyond those boundaries was no longer framed as missing. It was framed as irrelevant. This reframing completed the transformation. The earlier contradictions, missing rooms, altered labels, absent images, did not need to be resolved because they no longer registered as problems. They had been absorbed into the operating logic of preservation, and yet traces remained. In one access ledger, updated annually, the restricted status of a lower-level section is carried forward unchanged. No review date, no sunset clause, just a checkbox marked and remarked year after year. The repetition itself becomes justification. This is how silence stabilizes. Not through force, not through erasure, but through normalization. Once embedded in forms, language outlives intention. Decisions harden into defaults. Defaults masquerade as facts. The building does not change. The archive does not vanish. Only the questions disappear. On a laminated reference sheet used by docents, a small note appears beside the floor plan. Certain areas are not part of the current interpretive program. No explanation follows. The sentence is complete. It does not invite continuation. That sentence, clean, professional, final, marks the moment when silence ceased to be suspicious and became ordinary. And once silence is ordinary, it no longer needs to be defended. It simply operates, preparing the ground for the final question. What remains today when procedure has replaced memory? In 2022, Lyndhurst presents itself as complete. The rooms are intact, the floors polished, the roots established. Weddings unfold on the lawn. Film crews arrive with permits. Visitors move through the house with confidence, guided by a narrative that feels settled. Nothing appears provisional. Nothing suggests absence. And yet the present condition of the mansion reveals something quieter and more consequential. Explanations have not kept pace with preservation. The National Trust, now decades into its stewardship, manages Lyndhurst through a mature institutional framework. The curatorial voice is consistent, professional, and careful. Public materials emphasize architecture, craftsmanship, and continuity. J. Gould is described with restraint. His controversies are acknowledged only in outline. The house, meanwhile, is presented as a resolved artifact, interpreted, catalogued, and stable. The discovery in the present is not a new document, but a pattern of response. Inquiries made in 2022 about archival materials related to the lower-level spaces and early inventories do not produce refusals. They produce process. Requests are acknowledged, redirected, and narrowed. Access is described as subject to policy. Policy is described as standard. Standard is described as non-negotiable. The language is calm, courteous, and opaque. The action is administrative deflection. A researcher asking to consult early floor plans is told that relevant materials are not currently part of the interpretive archive. A question about missing photographs is met with the assurance that all extant materials are accounted for within the collection scope. No claim is made that nothing is missing, only that nothing missing is actionable. This distinction matters. It allows the institution to maintain accuracy without transparency. The archive is not denied, it is bounded. What lies beyond the boundary is not framed as secret, but as irrelevant to mission. The result is the same. Inquiry stops without confrontation. The consequence of this posture is subtle durability. Lyndhurst's public function thrives. Its private uncertainties persist without resolution. The unanswered questions about altered labels, absent images, surplus space remain suspended. They are neither refuted nor addressed. They exist in a state of administrative limbo, where the cost of clarification exceeds the perceived benefit. The present-day curatorial structure did not create this silence. It inherited it. But inheritance carries responsibility. By maintaining the same access language, restricted, not interpreted, outside in scope, the institution preserves not only the building, but the historical conditions that shaped its narrative. Silence, once normalized, becomes policy by default. What makes the present moment distinct is visibility. Lyndhurst is now widely documented. Floor plans circulate online. Events are photographed. Behind-the-scenes glimpses appear in promotional material. And yet, certain angles are never shown. Certain corridors never appear. The absence is consistent enough to be unremarkable. That consistency is the achievement. The risk today is not exposure through scandal, but erosion through inquiry. Digital archives collapse distance. Marginal documents resurface. Old valuations become searchable. The conditions that once protected fragmentation, physical separation, limited access, professional deference, are weakening. The institution responds by reinforcing language, not by reopening content. This produces a present tense defined by completeness without explanation. The rooms that are shown are genuine. The history that is told is accurate within its frame, but the frame itself is never examined. Visitors are not misled. They are simply not invited further. The inconsistency persists in plain sight. Modern safety plans account for structural volume that interpretive maps do not show. Maintenance schedules reference areas not described publicly. These are not errors. They are parallel truths operating without reconciliation. The present-day staff operates with professionalism. Their task is stewardship, not excavation. Within that mandate, the safest course is continuity. Continuity preserves funding, reputation, and operational clarity. Disruption threatens all three, and so the silence survives, not as secrecy, but as institutional equilibrium. A 2022 internal response to an archival inquiry concludes with a familiar phrase: "No additional materials are available for consultation at this time." The sentence does not deny existence. It postpones relevance. It is the modern descendant of every earlier restriction, omission, and reclassification. The house remains. The questions remain. What has changed is only the vocabulary that contains them. In the public guidebook, the floor plan ends cleanly at the edge of the interpretive route. No dotted lines, no shaded exclusions, just a boundary that appears natural because it has been drawn the same way for generations. And beyond that boundary, still measured, still maintained, still real, are spaces that require no locks, no warnings, no defenses. They persist through procedure alone. The present does not resolve the past. It organizes it. Lyndhurst stands today as a finished site with unfinished explanations. Its legacy is intact, its narrative coherent, its silence is professional. The architecture endures, the archive endures. Only the conversation has been carefully, successfully deferred. And that deferral, quiet, polite, and permanent, is the final structure the house has learned to preserve. In the years since 2022, Lyndhurst's present has continued to prove how effectively procedure can replace explanation. Nothing new has been sealed. Nothing dramatic has been denied. Instead, the existing framework has simply been allowed to persist, reinforced by the daily rhythms of operation. Tours begin and end on time. Event schedules are honored. Conservation reports are filed. The system functions smoothly precisely because it no longer recognizes unresolved questions as issues requiring action. What distinguishes the present moment is not concealment but administrative calm. When inconsistencies surface through academic inquiry, independent research, or public curiosity, they are absorbed by institutional pacing. Responses are measured. Timelines extend. Follow-ups dissolve into future review cycles. The process itself becomes the answer. The action sustaining this equilibrium is continuity management. Interpretive materials are periodically refreshed, but only within established boundaries. Language is modernized, accessibility improved, digital engagement expanded. None of these updates challenge the underlying structure of omission. Instead, they make it more resilient by wrapping it in relevance. A narrative that evolves stylistically appears alive, even when its foundations remain untouched. The consequence is a form of present-day insulation. Questions about the past are no longer perceived as threats, because the institution has learned how to host them without addressing them. Curiosity is acknowledged, logged, and set aside. The absence of resolution is reframed as patience, professionalism, or scope limitation. Over time, this reframing discourages persistence. Inquiry fades not because it is answered, but because it is outlasted. This dynamic has subtle effects on scholarship. Researchers adjust expectations. Projects narrow. Lines of inquiry that encounter repeated deferral are quietly abandoned in favor of more productive archives. The silence thus curates not only what is shown, but what is studied. Knowledge production bends toward accessibility, away from friction. The present also benefits from distance. The individuals who made earlier decisions are no longer alive. The paper trail, already thinned by time, is fragmented across institutions with differing mandates. Responsibility diffuses. No single office owns the omissions. Each inherits them as background conditions. In this environment, incompleteness becomes stable. The lack of explanation no longer feels temporary. It feels settled. Visitors sense no gap because the experience has been designed to feel whole. The house delivers what it promises: beauty, atmosphere, coherence. It does not promise disclosure. The most telling feature of the present is how unremarkable this has become. No alarms sound when an archive is inaccessible. No urgency attaches to missing context. Silence has been fully normalized into expectation. The system does not need to defend itself, because it no longer perceives itself as withholding anything. And yet, the material conditions that first generated silence still exist. Spaces remain maintained but undescribed. Measurements remain functional but unpublished. Documents remain cataloged but uncited. The physical reality of the house continues to exceed its narrative envelope. That excess is managed, not resolved. This reveals the final transformation of Lyndhurst's history, from contested past to curated environment. The building is no longer a site of inquiry. It is a venue. Inquiry is tolerated only insofar as it does not interfere with operation. Preservation, in this sense, has succeeded by stabilizing meaning rather than expanding it. The present does not erase the past. It renders it administratively irrelevant. A recent internal planning document outlines future priorities: sustainability upgrades, audience growth, expanded programming. Nowhere does it mention archival reconciliation. Not because it was rejected, but because it is no longer imagined as necessary. The omission is quiet, automatic, and complete. What remains today is not a mystery demanding resolution, but a structure that demonstrates how mysteries can be rendered inert. Lyndhurst no longer hides its gaps. It simply carries them forward without comment. The house continues to stand. The institution continues to function. The questions continue to exist, unanswered, unchallenged, and increasingly detached from consequence. And in that detachment lies the final condition of the present, a historical site that does not deny its silences, but has learned to live so comfortably with them that they no longer register as absences at all. The story does not end with a discovery. It settles into a pattern. From 1865, when Lyndhurst expanded quietly into something more than a residence, to 1880, when rooms began to change names instead of walls, the architecture learned a discipline more durable than stone. By 1892, with Jay Gould's death, discretion hardened into policy. What began as private judgment became administrative habit, and in 1961, when the mansion passed into institutional care under the National Trust, that habit was no longer questioned. It was formalized. The first evidence was never dramatic. A line in an inventory, a room named without being shown, a space counted but not drawn. Nothing explosive, nothing illegal, Just enough omission to require memory, and just enough time for memory to be managed. What followed was not concealment, but repetition. The same labels, the same exclusions, the same boundaries carried forward until they no longer appeared chosen at all. This is how omission becomes architecture. Doors close without sound. Documents are filed, not destroyed. Corridors remain lit, but unmarked. The power does not announce itself, it organizes. Each generation inherits a framework already decided and calls it preservation. Each administrator follows, procedures that feel neutral because their origins have been smoothed away. The building remains intact. The story does not. Lyndhurst stands today as proof that institutions rarely erase history outright. They decide something far more precise: how much of it the public is permitted to see. Not through secrecy, but through regulation. Not through silence imposed, but through silence normalized. The most sophisticated power does not hide. It catalogs, restricts, and waits. Somewhere inside the house, a file is returned to its place. A cabinet closes. A corridor remains outside the route. Dust settles evenly on stone that no longer needs explanation. What survives is not a secret, but a method, and that method reaches far beyond one mansion. If this account has lingered with you, let it be known. Every acknowledgement tells the unseen systems that these forgotten halls are still worth examining. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective adds light where history preferred shadow. Remain with us, so that you are here when the next sealed door finally opens. And if you are willing to step deeper into the silence that institutions build so carefully, the next chamber already waits. Because some histories endure not because they were forgotten, but because those who feared them perfected the art of leaving no one certain enough to speak.